Hello, this is part one of the Book Thief. I'm just going to be reading through the first couple of chapters, and after each chapter we'll be looking into the meanings behind each chapter and the themes of the overall book as we go through it. Alright, I'll just get started then. The prologue is called A Mountain Range of Rubble. In this part the narrator introduces himself, the colours, and the book thief. First the colours, then the humans. That's usually how I see things. Or at least how I try. Here's a small fact, you're going to die. I am, in all truthfulness, attempting to be cheerful about this whole topic, though most people find themselves hindered in believing me, no matter how my protestations. Please, trust me. I most definitely can be cheerful. I am amiable, agreeable, affable, and that's only the A's. Just don't ask me to be nice. Nice has nothing to do with me. Reaction to the aforementioned fact that you're going to die. Does this worry you? I urge you, don't be afraid. I'm nothing if not fair. Of course, an introduction, a beginning. Where are my manners? I could introduce myself properly, but that's not really necessary. You will know me well enough, and soon enough, depending on a diverse range of variables. It suffices to say that at some point in time, I will be standing over you as genially as possible. Your soul will be in my arms. A colour will be perched on my shoulder. I will carry you gently away. At that moment, you will be lying there. I really find people standing up. You'll be caked in your own body. There might be a discovery, a scream, will dribble down the air. The only sound I'll hear after that will be my own breathing and the sound of the smell of my footsteps. The question is, what colour will everything be at the moment when I come for you? What will the sky be saying? Personally, I like chocolate-coloured sky. Dark, dark chocolate. People say it suits me. I do. However, I try to enjoy every colour I see, the whole spectrum. A billion or so of flavours, none of them quite the same, and a billion or so flavours, none of them quite the same, and a sky to slowly suck on. It takes the edge off the stress, it helps me relax. Hello! We're just reading through the first couple of paragraphs of Book Thief. I'm up to page... this one doesn't have page numbers. I'm up to page 3. A small theory. People observe the colours of a day, only at the beginning and at the ends. But to me it's quite clear that a day merges through a multitude of shades and intuitions. With each passing moment, a single hour can consist of thousands of different colours. Waxy yellows, cloud-spat blues, murky darkness. In my line of work, I make it a point to notice them. As I've been alluding to, my one saving grace is distraction. It keeps me sane. It helps me cope. Considering the length of time I've been performing this job, the trouble is, who could ever replace me? Who could ever step in while I take a break in your stock standard resort style holiday destination, whether it be tropical or the ski strip variety? The answer, of course, is nobody, which has prompted me to make a conscious, deliberated decision to make distraction my holiday. Needless to say, my holiday in increments in colours. Okay. Well, reading up to this part, it's just sort of an introduction of the narrator, which we seem to acknowledge at this point as sort of a personification of death, which I find very interesting. The first time I read this book, I really enjoyed this type of narration, especially because of the premise that this book provides, because it's set in World War II. And so having a narrator from the perspective of death provides a very unique perspective and a very unbiased perspective over the whole event that took place. Because death occurs on all sides, no matter who's right or wrong in a war. So I found that very interesting. Still, it's possible that you might be asking, why does he even need a holiday? What does he need a distraction from? Which brings me to my next point. It's the leftover humans, the survivors. They're the ones I can't stand to look at, although on many occasions I still fail. I deliberately seek out the colours to keep my mind off them. But now and then I witness the ones who are left behind, crumbling amongst the jigsaw puzzle of realization, despair and surprise. They have punctured hearts. They have beaten lungs. Which in turn brings me to the subject I am telling you about tonight, or today, or whatever the hour or colour. It's the story of one of the perpetual survivors, an expert at being left behind. It's just a small story, really, about, amongst other things, a girl, some words, an accordionist, fanatical Germans, a Jewish fist fighter, and quite a lot of thievery. I saw the Book Thief 3 times. And that's the end of the prologue. So it just sort of introduces the narrator as well as what the book's going to be about in a very simple manner. But I really enjoy how the narrator is able to explain things in very simple terms without it seeming too analytical, because you're able to when you've something called an omniscient narrator, someone who knows everything that is going to happen from, past and present during the story. So I find that to be a very effective way to convey ideas, especially when it's about an all-knowing narrator. I mean, sometimes those narrators can be boring because they know everything that is going to happen, but when you convey it in a way where a little bit of information is conveyed a bit at a time, it makes it very interesting for the audience, so they don't feel spoiled with all the information they're being given. Okay, we're on to the first chapter called Beside the Railway Line. First up is something white, of the blinding kind. Some of you are most likely thinking that white is not really a colour, and all of that tired sort of nonsense. Well, I'm here to tell you that it is. White is without question a colour, and personally, I don't think you want to argue. Now for a reassuring announcement. Please be calm. Despite that previous threat, I am all bluster, I am not violent, I am not malicious, I am a result. So that's sort of, Death sort of confirming himself that death is more of a natural course. Death in itself is not violent, it is simply the result of the end. Which, describing it in this way is a very interesting way of conveying what death truly means, especially in the context of the story. Anyway, yes, it was white. It felt as though the whole globe was dressed in snow, like it had been pulled on its own. The way you pull a jumper, like a string unraveling. Next to the train line, footprints were sunken to their shins. Trees wore blankets of ice. As you might expect, someone had died. They couldn't just leave them on the ground, for now it wasn't such a problem, but very soon the track ahead would be cleared and the rain would need to move on. There were 2 guards. There was a mother and her daughter, 1 corpse. The mother and the girl in the corpse remained stubborn and silent. Well, what else did you want me to do? The guards were tall and short. The tall one spoke first. Although he was not in charge, he looked at the smaller, rounder one, the one with the juicy red face. "Well," was the response, "you can't just leave them like this, can we?" The tall one was losing patience. "Why not?" The smaller one damn near exploded. He looked at the tall one's chin and cried, "Spin it too? Are you insane?" The abhorrence on his cheeks was glowing thicker by the moment. His skin widened. "Come on," he said, trapezing along the I can't speak today, I'm sorry, I'm very sick. Trapezing through the snow. "We'll carry all three of them back on if we have to. We have to notify the next stop." As to me, I had already made the most elementary of mistakes. I can't explain to you the severity of my self-disappointment. Originally, I'd done everything right. I studied the blinding white snow sky, who stood at the window of the moving train. I practically inhaled it, but still I wavered, I buckled. I became interested in the girl. Curiosity got the better of me, and I resigned myself to stay as long as my schedule allowed, and I watched. 23 minutes later, when the train was stopped, I climbed out with them. A small soul was in my arms. I stood a little to the right. The dynamic train guard duo made their way back to the mother, the girl, and the corpse, the small male corpse. I clearly remember that my breath was loud that day. I'm surprised the guards didn't notice me as they walked by. The world was sagging now, under the weight of all that snow. Perhaps 10 meters to my left, the pale, empty-stomached girl was standing, frost-stricken, her mouth jittering. Her cold arms were folded, tears frozen to the book thief's face. Okay, that was the first chapter. We were introduced to the main character, also known as the book thief, as she was introduced by the narrator. So we now know that the book thief that they're talking about is the daughter of this woman, and that they're somehow related to this small male corpse. So I'm assuming it's a little boy, so probably her brother. So before the story's even really begun, we already see that tragedy is struck. So, yeah, it's an interesting way to start a story. But I guess you could say the same thing about war. The start is almost just as gruesome as the end, which I can say safely about this story as well. Sorry about this. I have somebody calling me. I'll be back in a second. Okay, sorry about that. I'll get back into it. The next chapter is called The Eclipse. The next color is my signature black, to show the poles of my versatility, if you like. It is the darkest moment before the dawn. This time I had come for a man of perhaps 24 years of age. It was a beautiful thing in some ways. The plane was still coughing, smoke was leaking from its lungs when it crashed. 3 deep gashes are made in the earth, Its wings are now sawn off arms. No more flapping for this little metallic bird. Some other small facts. Sometimes I arrive too early. I rush, and other people cling longer to life than expected. After a long collection of minutes, the smoke exhausted itself. There was nothing left to give. A boy arrived first, with cluttered breath, and what appeared to be a toolkit. With great trepidation, he approached the cockpit and watched the pilot gouging as if he was alive, at which point he still was. The book thief arrived perhaps 30 seconds later. Years had passed, but I still recognized her. She was panting. Okay. So after we have the first chapter of the first introduction of the book thief, we also have a second chapter which seems to be the beginning of the end. So it's an interesting way of using colour, because the white to symbolise the beginning of the story and the black to symbolise the end. So first we're given the first introduction of the book thief, and then we have in the second chapter when she dies. And then I guess for the rest of the book we have all of the in-between. Okay. From the toolkit the boy took out, of all things, a teddy bear. He reached in through the torn windscreen and placed it on the pilot's chest. The smiling bear sat huddled amongst the crowded wreckage of the man in the blood. A few minutes later, I took my chance. The time was right. I walked in, loosened his soul, and carried it gently out. All that was left was the body, the dwindling smell of smoke, and a smiling teddy bear. As the crowd finally arrived in full, things, of course, had changed. The horizon was beginning to charcoal. What was left of the blackness above was nothing now but a scribble, and disappearing fast. The man, in comparison, was the colour of bone. Skeleton-coloured skin, a ruffled uniform. His eyes were cold and brown like coffee stains. And the last scrawl from above formed what to me appeared an old yet familiar shape, a signature. The crowd did what crowds do. As I made my way through, each person stood and played with the quietness of it. It was a small concoction of disjointed hand movements, muffled sentences, and mute, self-conscious tones. When I glanced back at the plane, the pilot's open mouth appeared to be smiling, a final, dirty joke, another human punchline. He remained shrouded amongst his uniform as the greying light arm wrestled the sky. As with many of the others, when I began my journey away, there seemed to be a quick shadow again, a final moment of eclipse, the recognition of another soul gone. You see, to me, just for a moment, despite all the colours that touch and grapple with what I see in this world, I will often catch an eclipse when a human dies. I've seen millions of them. I've seen more eclipses than I care to remember. Okay, so that's the end of the second chapter. Aside from the beginning of the end, which I said sort of mid-chapter, there's not much else to analyse, apart from sort of death's acceptance of the ending of human life, because, it's his job. It's his job to collect all the souls. But even so, it doesn't stop him from feeling sadness for each individual person, which I find interesting. That death is conveyed as an entity of something with emotion, instead of something that's cold and decisive. It's something with feeling, something with empathy, which I find very interesting, seeing as death has not been able to feel death itself. Okay, so we'll move on to chapter 3. The third chapter is called The Flag. The last time I saw her was red. The sky was like soup, boiling and stirring. In some places it was burnt. There was black crumbs and pepper streaked amongst the redness. Earlier, kids had been playing hopscotch there, on the street, that looked like oil-stained pages. When I arrived, I could still hear the echoes, the feet tapping the road, the children's voices laughing, the smiles like salt but decaying fast. Then bombs. This time, everything was too late. The sirens, the cuckoo shrieks in the radio, all too late. Within minutes, mounds of concrete in the earth were stacked and piled. The streets were ruptured veins, blood steamed until it was dried on the road. The bodies were stuck there, like driftwood after the flood. They were glued down, every last one of them, a packet of souls. Was it fate? Misfortune? Was that what glued them down like that? Of course not. Let's not be stupid. It probably had more to do with the hurled bombs thrown by the humans hiding in the clouds. For hours, the sky remained a devastating, home-cooked red. The small German town had been flung apart. One more time. Snowflakes of ash fell so lovely. You were tempted to stretch out your tongue to catch them, taste them. Only they would have scorched your lips. They would have cooked your mouth. Clearly I see it. I was just about to leave when I found her kneeling there. A mountain range of rubble was written, designed, erected around her. She was clutching at a book. Apart from everything else, the book thief wanted desperately to go back to the basement to write, or to read through her story one last time. In hindsight, I see it too obviously on her face. She was dying for it. The safety, the home of it, but she could not move on. Also, the basement no longer existed. It was a part of the mangled landscape. Please, again, I ask you to believe me. I wanted to stop, to crouch down, to say, "I'm sorry, child," but it was not allowed. I did not crouch down. I did not speak. Instead, I watched her a while. When she was able to move, I followed her. She dropped the book. She kneeled. The book thief howled. Her book was stepped on several times as the cleanup began. And although orders were given to clear out only the mess of concrete, the girl's precious item was thrown aboard a garbage truck, at which point I was compelled. I climbed aboard and took it in my hand, not realizing I would read her story several hundred times over the years. On my travels, I would watch the places where we intersected and marvel at what the girl had saw and how she survived. What is the best I can do? Watch it fall into line with everything else? I spectated during that time. When I recollected her, I see a long list of colours, but there's 3 in which I saw in the flesh that resonate the most. Sometimes I manage to float far above those 3 moments. I hang suspended until a septic truth bleeds through clarity. That's when I see them formulate. Red, white, and black. They fall on top of each other, the scribbled signature black onto the binding global white, onto the soupy red. Okay. So obviously you can't see the book, but they have a little diagram of sorry, I have someone at the door, I'll be right back. Hello again. Alright, so I was just getting to explain, because it has some images in the book. For the, when it was describing the colours, red, white, and black, for the red part, it had a red square, then for the white, a white circle, and then for the black, a black swastika. So when you put them all together, it forms a Nazi flag. Surprise, surprise. So the main colours that he was referring to in terms of death were a result of the Nazi group, which seems to be what he's referring to when he's referring to those three colours. So I've already seen, so he's used the theme of colour twice now to represent beginnings and ends and emotion, as well as Nazism. Okay, I'll just read the rest of the chapter. Yes, often I am reminded of her, and in one of my vast array of pockets I kept her story to retell. It is one of the small legion I carry, each one extraordinary in its own right, each one an immense leap of an attempt to prove to me that you and your human existence are worth it. Here it is, one of a handful, the book thief. If you feel like it, come with me. I will tell you a story. I will show you something. Okay, so that's the first 3 chapters until we begin part 1, which is the Gravedigger's Handbook. Okay, I think I'll just read through the first few chapters and then we can make some analysis if you want to. You probably won't talk all too much though. The first chapter is called, I should probably talk about the first part. The Gravedigger's Handbook. The chapters are called Hamel Street, The Art of Sojmensting, An Iron-Fisted Woman, A Kiss Attempt, Jesse Owens, Sandpaper, The Smell of Friendship, A Heavyweight Champion, and The Mother of All Watchkins. So those are the names of the chapters. So we're moving on to the first one, which is Arrival on Hamel Street. That last time, that red sky. How does a book thief end up kneeling and howling and flanked by a man-made heap of ridiculous, greasy, cooked-up rubble? Years early, the start was snow. The time had come for one. Okay, so it's using the red as like a center, and again mentions snow, so white as beginnings. So it's just going to reoccur. That is called a motif. The repeated use of a theme or symbol to represent a deeper meaning in the story. So they're often using a lot of color as a symbol. Okay. A spectacularly, tragic event. A train was moving quickly. It was packed with humans. A 6-year-old boy died in the third carriage. The book thief and her brother were travelling down towards Munich, where they would soon be given over to foster parents. We now know, of course, the boy did not make it. Okay, so it was her brother. How it happened. There was an intense spurt of coughing, almost an inspired spurt, and soon after, nothing. When the coughing stopped, there was nothing but the nothingness of life, moving on with a shuffle or a near-silent twitch. A suddenness found its way onto his lips then, which were a curried brown colour, like peeling, like old paint, in desperate need of redoing. Their mother was asleep. I entered the train. My feet stepped through the cluttered aisle and my palm was over his mouth in an instant. No one noticed. The train galloped on, except the girl. With one eye open, I was still, once still in a dream, the book thief, also known as Lysel Meminger, could see without question that her younger brother, Werner, was now sideways and dead. His blue eyes stared at the floor, seeing nothing. Prior to waking up, the book thief had been dreaming about the Führer, Adolf Hitler. In the dream, she attended a rally at which he spoke, looked at the skull-coloured part in his hair and the perfect square of his moustache. She was listening contentedly to the torrent of words that was spilling from his mouth. His sentences glowed in the light. In a quieter moment, he actually crouched down and smiled at her. She returned the gesture and said, "Guten Tag, Herr Führer. Wie geht's dir heute?" I pronounced that terribly. She hadn't learned to speak too well, or even to read. She had rarely frequented school. The reason for that she would find out in due course. Just as the Führer was about to reply, she woke up. It was January 1939. She was 9 years old, soon to be 10. Her brother was dead. One eye open, one still in a dream. It will be better for a complete dream, I think. But I really have no control over that. The second eye jumped awake, and she caught me out, no doubt about it. It was exactly when I kneeled down and extracted his soul, holding it limply in my swollen arms. He warmed up soon after, but when I picked him up originally, the boy's spirit was soft and cold, like ice cream. He started melting in my arms. When warming up completely, healing. For Lysel Merminger, there was the imprisoned stiffness of the moment, the staggered onslaught of thoughts. Is it not? This isn't happening, and the shaking. Why do they always shake them? Yes, I know. I assume it has something to do with instinct, to stem the flow of truth. Her heart at the point was slippery and hot, loud, so loud, so loud. Stupidly I stayed, I watched. Next, her mother. She woke up with the same distraught shake. If you can't imagine it, think clumsy silence. Think bits and pieces of floating despair and drowning in a train. Snow had been falling consistently, and the service to Munich had forced to stop due to faulty track work. There was a woman wailing. A girl stood numbly next to her. In panic, the mother opened the door. She climbed down into the snow, holding the small body. What could the girl do but follow? As you've been informed, 2 guards also exited the train. They discussed and argued over what to do. The situation was unsavory, to say the least. It was eventually decided that all 3 of them should be taken to the next township and left things there to sort out. This time, the train limped through the snowed-in country. It hobbled and stopped. They stepped onto the platform, the body in the mother's arms. They stood. The boy was getting heavy. Lysel had no idea where she was. All was white. And as they remained at the station, she could only stare at the faded lettering of the sign in front of her. For Lysel, the town was nameless, and it was there that her brother Werner was buried 2 days later. Witnesses included a priest and 2 shivering gravediggers. An observation. A pair of train guards, a pair of gravediggers. When it came down to me, one of them called the shots, and the other did what it was told. The question is, what if the other is a lot more than one? Okay. Interesting take. Mistake. That's all I seem capable of times. For 2 days I went about my business. I traveled the globe as always, handing souls to the conveyor belt of eternity. I watched them trundle passively on. Several times I warned myself that I should keep a good distance from the burial of Lysol Mimminger's brother. I did not heed my advice. From miles away as I approached, I could already see the small group of humans standing frigidly amongst the wasteland of snow. The cemetery welcomed me like a friend, and soon I was with them. I bowed my head. Standing to Lysol's left, the grave diggers were rubbing their hands together and whinging about the snow and the current digging conditions. So hard to get through all the ice, and so on and so forth. One of them couldn't have been more than 14, an apprentice. When he walked away, a black book fell innocuously from his coat pocket without his knowledge. He'd taken perhaps 24 steps. A few minutes later, Lysol's mother started leaving with the priest. She was thanking him for his performance of the ceremony. The girl, however, stayed. Her knees entered the ground. Her moment had arrived. Still in disbelief, she started to dig. He couldn't be dead. He couldn't be dead. He couldn't. Within seconds, snow had carved into her skin. Frozen blood was cracked across her hands. Somewhere in all of the snow, she could see her broken heart in 2 pieces. Each half was glowing and beating under all that light. She had only realized her mother had come back for her when she felt the boniness of her hand on her shoulder. She was being dragged away. A warm scream filled her throat. Yeah, I found it interesting to see, again, death being conveyed in a very empathetic light, but also like his omnipresence, because whilst he's able to collect the souls around the globe, he's also able to pinpoint precise locations. It's sort of like the way that that gods are described in lots of different books. They are able to be all-knowing and yet incredibly specific with what they can view at the same time. Anyway, next paragraph. A small image, perhaps 20 meters away. When the dragging was done, the mother and the girl stood and breathed. There was something black and rectangular lodged into the snow. Only the girl saw it. She bent down and picked it up, and held it firmly in her fingers. The book had silver writing on it. They held hands. A final, soaking farewell was let go of, and they turned and left, looking back several times. As for me, I remained a few moments longer. I waved. No one waved back. Mother and daughter vacated the cemetery, and made their way towards the next train to Monarch. Both were skinny and pale. Both had sores on their lips. Lysol noticed it in the dirty, fogged-up window of the train when they boarded just before midday. In the written words of the book thief herself, the journey continued like everything had happened. When the train pulled into Benoff in Monarch, the passengers slid out as if it was from a torn package. There were people of every stature, but amongst them, the poor were most easily recognized. The impoverished always try to keep moving, as if relocating might help. They ignore the reality that a new version of the same problem will be waiting at the end of every trip. The relative you cringe to kiss. I think her mother knew this quite well. She wasn't delivering her children to the high echelons of Monarch, but a foster home had apparently been found. If nothing else, the new family could at least feed the girl and the boy a little better and educate them properly. The boy. Lysol was sure her mother carried the memory of him, slung over her shoulder. She dropped him. She saw his feet and legs and body slap the platform. How could she walk? How could she move? That's the sort of thing I'll never know or comprehend what humans are capable of. She picked him up and continued walking, the girl clinging to her side. Authorities were met and questions of the lateness of the boy were raised in their vulnerable heads. Lysel remained in the corner of the small dusty office as her mother sat with clenched thoughts on a very hard chair. There was the chaos of goodbye. The girl's head was buried into the woolly, worn shallows of the mother's coat. There had been some more dragging. Quite a way beyond the outskirts of Monarch was a town called Mulching. Said best like the likes of you and me is mulking. That's where they were taking her, to a street by the name of Himmel. Oh, it's the name of the chapter. Translation. Himmel means heaven. Whoever named Himmel Street certainly had a healthy sense of irony. Not because it was a living hell, it wasn't, but it sure as hell wasn't heaven either. Regardless, Lysel's foster parents were waiting. The Hubermans. They were expecting a girl and a boy, and would be paid a small allowance for having them. Nobody wanted to be the one to tell Rosa Huberman that the boy hadn't survived on the trip. In fact, nobody really wanted to tell her anything. As far as dispositions go, hers wasn't very enviable. Although she had a good record with foster kids in the past, apparently she'd straightened out a few. For Lysel, it was a ride in the car. She'd never been in one before. There was a constant rise and fall of her stomach, and the futile hope they'd lose their way or change their minds amongst it all. Her thoughts couldn't help turning towards her mother, back at the Bonhoff, waiting to leave again. Shivering and bundled up in that useless coat. She'd be eating her nails waiting for the train. The platform would be long and uncomfortable, a slice of cold cement. Would she keep an eye out for the approximate burial site of her son on the return trip? Or would sleep be too heavy? The car moved on, with Lysel dreading the last lethal turn. The day was grey, the colour of Europe. Curtains of rain drawn around the car, nearly there. The foster care lady, Frau Heinrich, turned and smiled. Dein neues Heim, your new home. Lysel had made a clear circle of the dribble glass and looked out. A photo of Himmel Street. The buildings appear to be glued together, mostly small houses and unit blocks that look nervous. There is a murky snow spread out like carpet. There is concrete, an empty hat stand, trees, and grey air. A man who was also in the car, he remained with the girl while Frau Heinrich disappeared inside. He never spoke. Lysel assumed he was there to make sure she didn't run away or force her inside of the grave, or force her inside if she gave him any trouble. Later, however, when the trouble did start, he simply sat there and watched. Perhaps he was on the last resort, the final solution. After a few minutes, a very tall man came out, Hans Huberman, Lysel's foster father. On one side of him was the medium-height Frau Heinrich. On the other side was the squat shape of Rosa Huberman, who looked like a small wardrobe with a coat thrown over it. There was a distinct waddle to her walk, almost cute if it hadn't been for her face, which was like creased up cardboard, and annoyed, as if she was merely tolerating all of it. Her husband walked straight with a cigarette smouldering between his fingers. He rolled his own. The fact was this: Lysel would not get out of the car. Was dies los mit deinem kind? Sorry, apologies for my pronunciation again. Rosa Huberman inquired. She said it again. What is wrong with this child? Okay, so I'm guessing that's what the translation means. She stuck her face inside the car and said, "Nah, come." The seat in front was flung forward. A corridor of cold light invited her out. She would not move. Outside, through the circle she had made, Lysel could see the tall man's fingers still holding the cigarette. Ash stumbled from its edge and lunged and lifted several times before it hit the ground. 15 minutes till they were able to coax her from the car. It was the tall man who did it, quietly. There was the gate next, which she clung to. A gang of tears trudged from her cheeks and held on and refused to go inside. People started to gather on the streets until Rosa Huberman swore at them, after which they reversed back whence they came. So I just need to blow my nose for a second. Alright. A translation of Rosa Huberman's announcement. What are you assholes looking at? Eventually, Lysel Merminger walked gingerly inside. Hans Huberman had her by one hand. The small suitcase had her by the other. Buried beneath the folded layer of clothes in that suitcase was a small black handbook, which for all we know was a 14-year-old gravedigger. For all we know, a 14-year-old gravedigger in a nameless town had probably spent the last few hours looking for, I promise you. I imagine him saying to his boss, I have no idea what happened to it. I've been looking everywhere. I'm sure he would have never suspected the girl. And yet there it was, a black book with the silver words written against the ceiling of her clothes. The Gravedigger's Handbook, a 12-step guide to gravedigging success, published by Bayron Cemetery Association. That's morbidly funny. The book thief had struck for the first time the beginning of an illustrious career. And that's the end of the first chapter. So it's just about her travels and her trauma and getting into the house and stuff like that. But I guess from this chapter we can also see how these new characters play out in the story. Because we can already tell that Hans Huberman is the quiet, reassuring type. And Rosa Huberman, however, is the loud and disciplinary type. So we can sort of imagine who Lysel will favour throughout her life. And who will become her enemy. I mean, we don't know if Rosa will become her enemy yet. She could be an important part of the story as a positive influence in Lysel's life, but it'll be be in a unique way. It'll be in her own way. Okay, the next chapter is called Growing Up a Sawman. Pronouncing it in Japanese. Why? I can't do German. Sawmensch. I'm just going to call it that. Yes, an illustrious career. I should hasten to admit, however, that there was a considerable hiatus between the first stolen book and the second. Another noteworthy point was the first was stolen from the snow, the second from fire. Not to omit the others were also given to her. All up, she owned 14 books, but she saw her story was made up of predominantly 10 of them. Of those 10, 6 were stolen. One showed up at the kitchen table, and 2 of them were made for her by a hidden Jew, and one was delivered by a soft, yellow-dressed afternoon. When she came to write her story, she would wonder exactly when the books and the words started not to just mean something, but everything. It was when she first set eyes on the room with shelves and shelves of them, or when Max Wunderberg arrived on Hamel Street carrying handfuls of suffering at Hitler's Mein Kampf? Was it reading in the shelters? The last parade of dark? Was it the word shaker? Perhaps there would never be a precise answer as to when it occurred. In any case, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we make into any of that, we need a tour of Lysel Merminger's beginnings on Himmel Street and the Ark of Sormenstein. Upon her arrival, you can see the bite marks of snow on her hands, the frosty blood on her fingers. Everything about her was undernourished. Wire like shins, coat hanger arms. She did not produce it easily. When it came, she had a starving smile. Her hair was close enough brand of German blonde, but she had dangerous eyes, dark brown. You didn't want dark brown eyes in Germany about that time. Perhaps she received them from her father, but she had no way of knowing, as she couldn't remember him. There was really only one thing she knew about her father. It was a label. She did not understand. A strange word. Communist. She'd heard it several times in the past few years. There was boarding houses crammed with people, rooms filled with questions, and that strange word, was always somewhere standing in the corner, watching it from the dark. They wore suits, uniforms, no matter where they went. There it was each time her father was mentioned. She asked her mother what it meant. She was told it wasn't important, that she shouldn't worry about such things. At one boarding house, there was a healthy woman who tried to teach the children to write using charcoal on the wall. Lysel was tempted to ask the word's meaning, but it never eventuated. One day that woman was taken away for questioning, and she didn't come back. When Lysel arrived in Mulching, she had at least some inkling of that she was being saved. First time chat viewer. Okay, why are you reading? I'm reading partially because I'm recording it for YouTube, and I know a lot of people that find it very difficult to pick up a book and start reading, so I thought it would be nice for me to read to people who find it difficult to read. Yeah, not to mention I want to improve my reading, so this is beneficial for me as it is for you. Or if you want to, listen to this while you're sleeping or something like that, and, it might help you to sleep, because I used to listen to reading when I was very young. My parents always used to read to me. Plus, this book is a very good book, and if you hate reading, I think you should still know the story. It's a very good story. Okay, hello. Right now, I'm on chapter 2, I think? No, I'm on chapter 1 of part 1. And, where was I? I lost my place. Okay. When Lysel arrived in Mulching, she had some inkling of that she was being saved. But that was not a comfort. If her mother loved her, why would she leave her on someone else's doorstep? Why? The fact that she knew the answer, if only at the most basic level, seemed to be beside the point. Her mother was constantly sick, and there was never any money to fix her. She knew that, but that didn't mean she had to accept it. No matter how many times she told her she loved her, there was no recognition. The proof was in the abandonment. Nothing had changed the fact that she was a lost, skinny child in a foreign place, with more foreign people alone. Are you going to read the whole book in one? Of course not. It's just a thick-ass book. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read the first few chapters. You want me to give you a summary of what's happening so far, so you're not confused? Okay, so far we've read through the introduction of the narrator, which is Death. But you got a thick ass. That was uncalled for. Yeah, so far we've been introduced to the narrator, which is Death, as well as the main character, which is a little girl called Lysel, and she's just been dropped off at a foster home, and she's protesting it because her mother has abandoned her, and we've just found out that it's because her mother's constantly sick and can't look after her. Okay, now where are we up to? The Hubermans, by the way, are her foster family. The Hubermans lived on one small block of houses on Hamel Street. A few rooms, a kitchen, and an outhouse shared with neighbours. The roof was flat, and there was a shallow basement for storage. It was not a basement of adequate depth. In 1939, there wasn't a problem until 42 and 43. It was, when the air raid started. They always needed to rush down the street to a better shelter. In the beginning, it was the profanity that made the greatest impact. It was so vehement and prolific. Every second word was either Sorchnik or Circro or Oschnok, which I assume are German swear words. Sorry. For people who aren't familiar with these words, I should explain. Sor, of course, refers to pigs. In that case, Sorchmet refers to castigate, berate, of plain humiliate a female. So I'm guessing it just means bitch. Sokril, pronounced Sokroya, is for males, so dick. It's a compliment, No. Sorry. You don't even know what my ass looks like. You just sort of assumed that. Anyway. Arschlot can be translated directly into asshole. That word, however, does not differentiate between sexes. It simply is. Sorschmich dideklens. Lysel's foster mother shouted that first evening when she refused to have a bath. You filthy pig! Why aren't you undressed? She was good at being furious. In fact, you could say that Losa Huberman had a face decorated with constant fury. That was how the creases were made in the cardboard box texture of her complexion. Lysel naturally was bathed in anxiety. There was no way she was getting into any bath, or into any bed for that matter. No. No. Okay. Lysel naturally She was twisted into one corner of the closet-like washroom, clutching for the non-existent arms of the wall, for some level of support. There was nothing but dry paint, difficult breathing, and the dulge of abuse from Rosa. Leave her alone, Hans Huberman entered the fray. His gentle voice made its way in as if slipping through a cloud. Leave her to me. She moved closer and sat on the floor against the wall. The tiles were cold and unkind. Do you know how to roll a cigarette? He asked her, and for the next hour or so they sat in the rising pool of darkness playing with the tobacco and cigarette papers. Hans Huberman smoking them. When the hour was up, Lysel could roll a cigarette moderately well. She still didn't have a bath. Some facts about Hans Huberman. He loved to smoke. The main thing he enjoyed about smoking was the rolling. Arts and craftsman here. He was a painter by trade and played the piano accordion. This came in handy, especially in the winter. Shame, really. You should gift on. This isn't that kind of stream, my man. If you're looking for someone to show their ass to you, I think you can find a streamer that's willing to show you. But I'm just here for reading, okay? Sorry. This came in handy, especially winter, when he could make a little money playing at the pubs of mulching like Nola. He had already cheated in one war, but would later be put into another, as a perverse kind of reward. He would somehow manage to avoid me again. Okay. So we've been further introduced to Hans Huberman, who is an interesting character. He seems to be quiet, reserved, but he's already developing a good relationship with Lysel, which is nice. So we can already tell that he's going to be the favorite parent in this book, but we're going to have to see how her relationship with Rosa develops as well. To most people, Hans Huberman was barely visible, an unspecial person. Certainly his painting skills were excellent, his music ability was better than average. Somehow though, and I'm sure you've met other people like this, he had the ability to appear in the background. Even if he was just standing at the front of a queue, he was just there, not noticeable, not important, or particularly valuable. The frustration of that appearance, as you can imagine, was the complete misleadance, let's say. There was most definitely value in him, and it did not go unnoticed by Lysel Merminger, the human child, so much cannier at times than stupefying, ponderous adults. She saw it immediately, his manner, the quiet air around him. She turned the light on in the small callous washroom. That night, Lysel observed the strangeness of her foster father's eyes. They were made of kindness and silver, like soft silver melting. Lysel, upon seeing those eyes, understood that Hans Huberman was worth a lot. Okay, that's cute. Some facts about Rosa Huberman. She was 5 foot 1 inch tall and wore her browny grey strands of elastic hair in a bun to supplement the Huberman income. She did the washing and the ironing for 5 of the wealthier households in Walcheren. Her cooking was atrocious. She possessed the unique ability to aggravate almost everybody she ever met. She did love Lysel Merminger. Her way of showing it just happened to be strange. It involved bashing her with a wooden spoon and words at various intervals. When Lysel finally had a bath after 2 weeks of living on Himmel Street, Rose gave her an enormous injury-inducing hug, nearly choking her, saying, "Sauce means you do dreckings. It's about time." After a few months, there was no longer Mr. and Mrs. Huberman with a filthy fistful of words. Rosa now said, "Now listen, Lysel. From now on, you call me Mama." She thought a moment. "What did you call your real mother?" Lysel answered quickly, "Ach, Mama, also Mother." "Well, I'm Mama number 2, then." She looked over at her husband, and him over there. She seemed to collect the words in her hand and put them and hurl them across the table. "That Sockrel, that filthy pig. You call him Papa. Verschwit? Understand?" "Yes," Lysel promptly agreed. Quick answers were appreciated in this household. "Yes, Mama," corrected her. "Solschmick, call me Mama when you talk to me." At that moment, Hans Huberman had just completed rolling a cigarette. After licking the paper and joined it all up, he looked over at Lysel and winked. She would have no trouble calling him Papa. Okay, moving on to the next chapter. This is chapter 3, called The Woman with the Iron Fist. Those first few months were definitely the hardest. Every night Lysel would nightmare, her brother's face staring at the floor of the train. She would wake up swimming in her bed, screaming and drowning in the flood of sheets. On the other side of the room, the bed was meant for her brother, floating boat-like in the darkness. Slowly, with the arrival of consciousness, it sank seemingly into the floor. This vision didn't help matters, and it would usually be quite a while before the screaming stopped. Possibly the only good come out of those nightmares was that it brought Hans Huberman, who knew Papa, into the room to soothe her, to love her. He came in every night and sat with her. The first couple of nights he stayed, a stranger to kill the aloneness. A few nights after that, he whispered, "Shh, I'm here, it's all right." And after 3 weeks, he held her. Trust was accumulated quickly, due primarily to the brute strength of this man's gentleness, his there-ness. The girl knew from the outset that he'd always appear mid-scream, and he would not leave. Okay. So we already see a relationship developing between Hans and Lysel, which is nice. Yeah, so we can, as we predicted earlier, we can already see who's the favorite parent in the situation. I'll continue reading with chapter 3. A definition not found in the dictionary. Not leaving, an act of trust, love, often deciphered by children. Hans Huberman would sit sleepy-eyed on the bed as Lysel cried into his sleeves and breathed him in. Every morning, just after 2 o'clock, she fell asleep again to the smell of him. A mixture of dead cigarettes, decades of paint, and human skin. When morning came in earnest, she was a few feet away from him, crumpled, almost halved in the chair. He never used the other bed. Lysel would climb out and cautiously kiss his cheek, and he would wake up and smile. Some days Papa told her to get back into bed and wait a minute, and he would return with his accordion to play for her. Lysel would sit up and hum, her cold toes clenched with excitement. No one had ever given her music before. She would grin herself stupid, watching the lines draw themselves down his face, the soft metal of his eyes, until the swearing arrived in the kitchen. "Stop that noise, Socro!" Papa would play a little longer. He would wink at the girl clumsily, she'd wink back. A few times, purely to incense Mama further, he also brought the instrument to the kitchen and played through breakfast. Papa's bread and jam would be half eaten on his plate, curled into the shape of bite marks, and the music would look Lysel in the face. I know it sounds strange, but that's how it felt to her. Papa's right hand strolled through the tooth-colored keys. His left hit the buttons. He especially loved him when he hit the silver sparkled one, the C major. The accordion's snatched yet shiny black exterior came back and forth as his arm squeezed the dusty bellows, making it suck in the air and throw it back out in the kitchen on those mornings. Papa made the accordion live. I guess it makes sense when you really think about it. How do you tell if something's alive? You check if it's breathing. The sound of the accordion was in actual fact also the announcement of safety, daylight during the day. It was impossible to dream of her brother. She would miss him and frequently cry into the tiny washroom as quietly as possible. But she was still glad to be awake. On her first night with the Hubermans, she had hidden her last link to him, the grave digger's handbook, under her mattress, and occasionally she would pull it out and hold it, staring at the letters on the cover, touching the print inside. She had no idea of any of what it was saying. The point is, it didn't really matter what the book was about. It was what it meant that was more important. The book's meaning. The last time she saw her brother, and it was the last time she saw her mother. Sometimes she would whisper the word Mama and see her mother's face 100 times in a single afternoon. But those were small miseries compared to the terror of her dreams. At those times, in the enormous mileage of sleep, she had never felt so completely alone. As I'm sure you've already noticed, there are no other children in the house. The Hubermans had 2 of their own, but they were older and had moved on. Hans Jr. worked in the center of Munich, and Trudy held a job as a housemaid and childminder. Soon they would both be in the war. One would be making bullets and the other would be shooting them. School, as you might imagine, was a terrific misery. Although it was state-run, there was heavy Catholic influence, and Lysol and Lutheran, not the most auspicious start. They had discovered that she couldn't read or write. Humiliatingly, she had cast down with the younger kids who had been learning the alphabet. Even though she was thin-boned and pale, she felt gigantic amongst the midget children. She often wished she was pale enough to disappear altogether. Even at home, there wasn't much room for guidance. "Don't ask him for help," Mum pointed out. "That's soccer." Papa was staring out the window. It was often his habit. He left school in 4th class. Without turning around, Papa calmly answered, but with venom. "Well, don't ask her either." He dropped some ash outside. "She left school in 3rd class." There were no books in the house, apart from the one she kept secret under her mattress. The best Lysol could do was speak the alphabet under her breath before she was told in uncertain terms to keep quiet. All that mumbling wasn't until later when there was a bedwetting incident. Mid-nightmare, there was an extra reading education began. Unofficially, it was called midnight class. Even though it usually commenced around 2 in the morning. More of that soon. In mid-February, she turned 10. She was given a used doll that had a missing leg and yellow hair. It was the best that we could do. Papa apologized. "What are you talking about? She's lucky to have that much," Mama corrected. Hans continued his examination of the remaining leg while Lysol tried on her new uniform. 10 years old meant Hitler Youth. Hitler Youth meant a small brown uniform. Being female, Lysol was involved into the junior division that was called the BDM. Okay, so far we've learned a little bit more about Lysol and her development with her foster parents. So we both know that her parents are also uneducated, as they don't have any books in the house and they left school very early, which kind of leads us to believe that they're both quite impoverished, as, you could also dictate by their jobs, as he's a musician and painter by trade, and the mother is a housekeeper of sorts. So we can see that both of them are pretty uneducated and live in poverty, as they aren't able to provide much for her. Okay, on to the next part. Explanation of the abbreviation for BDM. It stood for Bund Deutsche Mädchen, United German Girls. The first thing they did there was make sure that your Heil Hitler was properly working. Then they taught you how to march straight, roll bandages, and sew up clothes. You were also taken hiking and on other such activities. Wednesday and Saturday were designated meeting days, from 3 in the afternoon until 5. Each Wednesday and Saturday, Papa would walk Lysol to the BDM headquarters and pick her up 2 hours later. They never spoke much about it. They just held hands and listened to each other's feet. Papa had a cigarette or two. The only anxiety Papa brought her was the fact that she was frequently leaving. Many evenings he would walk into the living room, which had doubled as the Huberman's bedroom, pull the accordion from the old cupboard and squeeze the past into the kitchen to the front door. He walked up Hamel Street. Mama would open the window and cry out, "Don't be home too late." "Not so loud." He turned and called back, "Sucker, lick my ass, I swear I'll be as loud as I want." The echo of her swearing followed him up the street. He never looked back, or at least not until he was sure his wife was gone. On those evenings at the end of the street, accordion case in hand, he would turn around just before Frau Diller's corner shop and see the figure who had replaced his wife in the window. Briefly, his long, ghostly hand would rise, before he turned again and walked slowly on, The next time Lysol saw him would be 2 in the morning, when he dragged her gently from her nightmare. Okay, so more interesting stuff. So this part sort of further emphasised that they're impoverished and they don't have a lot of money to spend. And we've also been let known about BDM, which is sort of the female equivalent for Hitler Youth, which, you know, teach them to be good wives and good nurses during the war, which then commenced later on. As it's 1939, it's about to begin, but it's not in full swing quite yet. So I guess we can see that as a sort of... what's the word for it? I guess a sort of prologue for the war that's about to begin. Evenings in the small kitchen were raucous. Without fail, Rosa Huberman was always talking, and when she was talking, she was fine. She was constantly arguing and complaining. There was no one really to argue with, but Mama managed to expertly every chance she get. She could argue with an entire world in that kitchen, and almost every evening she did. Once they had eaten and Papa was gone, Lysol and Rosa would remain there, and Rosa would do the ironing. A few times a week, Lysol would come home from school and walk the streets of Mulching with her mother, picking up and delivering washing and ironing from the wealthier parts of town. Strossi, Hyde Strossi. A few others mother would deliver the ironing or pick up washing with a dutiful smile. But as soon as the door was shut, she walked away. She would curse those rich people with all their money and laziness. Sorry? Two I'm so sorry. I can't pronounce German words. To Geschlechtgut, to wash their own clothes. I'm gonna guess that means lazy. Too lazy to wash their own clothes, she would say, despite her own dependence on them. Him, she accursed Herr Vogel in Herd Street, made all his money from his father. He throws it away on women and drink and washing and ironing, of course. It was like a roll call of scorn. Herr Vogel and Mr. and Mrs. I don't even want to pronounce their name. Mr. and Mrs. Plofhevel Wirfer, Helena Schmidt, and the Weingartners were all guilty of something. Apart from his drunkenness and expensive lechery, Ernst Vogel, according to Rosa, was constantly scratching his louse-ridden hair, licking his fingers, and handing over the money. I should wash it before I come home, was his summation. The Pufferenhavers scrutinized the result. Not one crease in the shirts, please, Rosa imitated. Not one wrinkle in the suit. And then stand there and inspect it right in front of me, under my nose. What a schnaddle! What rubbish! The Weingarters were apparently stupid people with a constantly molting skirmish of a cat. Do you know how long it takes me to get rid of all that fur? It's everywhere. Helena Schmidt was a rich widow, that old cripple sitting there just wasting away. She's never had to work a day in her life. As we can tell, Rose is a bit of a bitch. Very spiteful person. Rosa's greatest disdain, however, was reserved for 8 Grande Strasse, a large house high on a hill in the upper part of Mulching. This one, she pointed out to Lysol the first time she went there, is the mayor's house. That crook. His wife sits at home all day, too mean to light a fire. It's always freezing in there. She's crazy. She punctured the words. Absolutely crazy. At the gate, she mentioned to the girl, "You go." Lysol was horrified. A giant brown door with a brass knocker stood atop a small flight of steps. What? Mother shoved her. Don't you want me, Skirmish? Move it. Lysol moved it. She walked the path, climbed the steps, and hesitated and knocked. A bathrobe answered the door. Inside it, a woman with startled eyes, hair like fluff, and a posture of defeat stood in front of her. She saw Mama at the gate and handed the girl a bag of washing. "Thank you," Weitzel said, but there was no reply, only the door. It closed. "You see," Mama said, when she returned to the gate, "this is what I have to put up with, these rich bastards, these lazy swines." Holding the washing as they walked away, Lysa looked back. The brass knocker eyed from the front door. Okay, so we can already see this character might be a reoccurring one later on, because she was very well described. So everyone thinks that she is the crazy wife of the mayor, who just walks around the house all day in her bathrobe. It'll be interesting to see how her character develops later on. When she finished berating the people she worked for, Rosa Huberman would usually move on to her favourite theme of abuse, her husband. Looking at the bag of washing and the hunched houses, she would talk and talk. If your papa was any good, she informed Lysel every time they walked through mulching, I wouldn't have to do this. She sniffed with derision. A painter. Why marry that Altschlit? That's what they told me, my family, that is. Their footsteps crunched along the path, and here I am, walking the street, slaving in my kitchen, because that sock roll has never has any work. No real work, anyway. Just a pathetic accordion in those dirty holes every night. Yes, Mama. Is that all you've got to say? Mama's eyes were like pale blue cutouts pasted onto her face. They'd walk on. With Lysel carrying the sack at home, it was washed in a boiler next to the stove, hung up by the fireplace in the living room, and ironed in the kitchen. There was an action. Did you hear that? Mama asked nearly every night. The iron was in her fist, heated from the stove. Light was dull through the house, and Lysel, sitting at the kitchen table, would be staring at the gaps of the fire in front of her. What? She replied. What is it? That was Holtzwinkel. Mama was already out of her street. That skirmish just spat on our door again. It was tradition for a Frau Holtzwinkel, one of their neighbours, to spit on the Huberman's door every time she walked past. The front door was only meters from the gate. Let's just say that Frau Holtzwinkel had a distance and the accuracy. The spitting was due to the fact that she and Rosa Huberman had been engaged in some kind of decade-long verbal war. Nobody knew the origin of the hostility. They'd probably forgotten it themselves. Frau Holtzwinkel, I'm going to get very sick pronouncing that name, was a wiry woman. And while obviously spiteful, she'd never married, but she had 2 sons, a few years older than Huberman's offspring. Both were in the army, and both will make cameo appearances by the time we're finished here, I assure you. In the spiteful stakes, I should also say that Frau Holtzwinkel was thorough with her spitting too. She never neglected to spuck on the door a number of times. A number of 33, she would say, Schrecklein, every time she passed. The only thing I've noticed about Germans, they seem very fond of pigs. Okay, hello to the new people that are here. We're just on to chapter 3. We're about to finish chapter 3 of the book Thief. So far we've gotten to know the narrator and some of the main characters of the story. We are following along with the narrator, which takes the form of Death. And right now we're being introduced to the characters of the foster parents quite thoroughly. Okay, so I'll just continue on with the next paragraph. A small question in its answer. And who do you think was made to clean the spit off that door each night? Yeah, you got it. When a woman with an ironed fist tells you to go out there and clean the spit off the door, you do it. Especially when the iron's hot. It was all a part of the routine, really. Each night, Lysa would step outside, wipe the door, and watch the sky. Unusually, was like spillage, cold and heavy, slippery and grey. But once in a while some stars would nerve and rise and glow. If only for a few minutes. On those nights she would stay a little longer and wait. Hello, stars. Waiting for the voice from the kitchen, or till the stars were dragged down again into the waters of the German sky. And that's the end of chapter 3. Okay, so the next chapter is called The Kiss, a Childhood Decision Maker. Yeah, it feels kind of weird talking to myself about the book, but I'm sure you guys are enjoying it to some extent anyway. Okay, I think we're about to be introduced to the childhood friend character in this story. As with most small towns, Mulching was filled with characters. A handful of them lived on Himmel Street. Frau Hotzfeld was only one cast character. The others included the likes of Rudy Steiner, the boy next door who was obsessed with the black American athlete Jesse Owens, Frau Diller, the staunch Aryan corner shop owner, Tommy Miller, a kid whose chronic ear infections had resulted in several operations, a pink river of skin painted across his face, and a tendency to twitch. Oh no, poor Tommy. And a man primarily known as, I don't even want to pronounce that, Pithekins, whose vulgarity made Rosa Hoopman look like a wordsmith and a saint. On the whole, it was a street filled with relatively poor people. Despite the rise of Germany's economy under Hitler's economy. Sorry, I fucked up that entire thing. On the whole, the street was filled with relatively poor people, despite the apparent rise of Germany's economy under Hitler, poor sides of town still existed. Okay. As mentioned already, the house next door to the Hubermans was rented by a family called Steiner. The Steiners had 6 children. One of them, the infamous Rudy, would soon become Lysel's best friend, and later her partner sometime catalyst in crime. She met him on the street. Okay, yeah, so we are meeting the childhood friend in this chapter. A few days after Lysel's first bath, Mama allowed her to play with the other kids on Himmel Street. Friendships were made outside regardless of the weather. The children rarely visited each other's homes, for they were small and there were usually very little in them. Also, they conducted their favorite pastime like professionals on the street, football. Teams were set. Garbage bins were used to mark out the goals. Being the new kid in town, Lysel was immediately shoved between one pair of those bins. Tommy Miller was finally set free despite being the most useless footballer on Himmel Street had ever seen. It all went nicely for a while until the fateful moment when Rudy Steiner was unpinned in the snow by Tommy Miller's foul frustration. "What?" Tommy shouted. His face twitched in desperation. "What did I do?" A penalty was awarded to everyone on Rudy's team, and now it was Rudy Steiner against the new kid, Lysel Merninger, our main character. He placed the ball on a grubby mound of stone, confident of the usual outcome. After all, Rudy hadn't missed a penalty in 18 shots, even when the opposition had made a point of booting Tommy Miller out of goal. No matter who they replaced him with, Rudy would score. On this occasion, they tried to force Lysel out. As you might imagine, she protested, and Rudy agreed. No, she smiled. No, he smiled. Let her stay. He was rubbing his hands together. The snow had stopped falling on the filthy streets now, and the muddy footprints had gathered between them. Rudy shuffled in and fired the shot, and Lysel dived and somehow deflected it with her elbow. She stood up grinning, but the first thing she saw was a snowball smashing into her face. Half of it was mud. It stung like crazy. "How do you like that?" the boy grinned, and he ran off in the pursuit of the ball. "Sacre," Lysel whispered. The vocabulary of her new home was catching on fast. Some facts about Rudy Steiner. He was 8 months older than Lysol and had bony legs, sharp teeth, gangly blue eyes, and hair the color of a lemon. 1/6 of Steiner children who was permanently hungry. One of 6 Steiner children who was permanently hungry. On Himmel Street, he was considered a little crazy. This was on the account of the event that was rarely spoken about but widely regarded as the Jesse Owens incident, in which he painted himself charcoal black and ran the 100 meters at the local sporting event one night. Oh no. Oh. Oh, blackface, that's not great. Okay, hello, new people. We're just reading The Book Thief. We're up to chapter 4. Okay, next paragraph. Insane or not, Rudy was destined to be Lysol's best friend. A snowball in the face was surely the perfect beginning to a lasting friendship. A few days later... Hello, how are you doing? I'm doing very good, thank you. We're just reading through The Book Thief. We're on the 4th chapter, as I said earlier. Yeah, I'm kind of sick because I got COVID, but it's given me a lot of time to get through my reading and start streaming. This is my first stream, so yeah. Okay. I'll just continue with this paragraph then. Insane or not, Rudy was always destined to be Lysol's best friend. A snowball to the face was the perfect beginning to a lasting friendship. A few days after Lysol started school, she went along with the Steiners. Rudy's mother, Barbara, made him promise to walk the new girl, mainly because she'd heard about the snowball. To Rudy's credit, he was happy enough to comply. He was not the junior, misogynistic type of boy at all. He liked girls a lot. He liked Lysol, hence the snowball. In fact, Rudy Steiner was one of those audacious little bastards who actually fancied himself with the ladies. Every childhood seemed to have exactly such a little juvenile in its midst and mists. He's the boy who refused to fear the opposite sex purely because everyone else chose to embrace that particular fear. Well, I hope you feel better. Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm on to the 3rd day, so I am feeling a bit better, which is good. The worst symptoms have subsided. Sorry. Embrace that particular fear. He's the type who is unafraid to make a decision. In this case, Rudy had already made up his mind about Lysol learning her. On the way to school, he tried to point out certain landmarks in the town, or at least he managed to slip it all in, somewhere telling his... Sorry? If you get tired, it's best to stop and rest. Well, thank you. I've only been streaming for an hour and a half. I should be alright. Thank you for your concern, though. Shut his faces, da-da-da-da. On the way to school, he tried to point out certain landmarks in the town, or at least he managed to slip it all in somewhere between telling his younger siblings to shut their faces, and the older ones telling him to shut his. His first point of interest was a small window on the 2nd floor of an apartment block. That's where Tommy Miller lives. He realized that Lysol didn't recall him. The Twitcher? When he was 5 years old, he got lost at the markets on the coldest day of the year. 3 hours later, they found he was frozen solid and had an awful earache from the cold. After a while, his ears were all infected inside, and he had 3 or 4 operations. The doctors wrecked his nerves, so now he twitches. Oh, poor Tommy. That's not great. Nice little chanted. And he's bad at football. The worst. Oh. The kids are so blunt. Next was the corner shop at the end of Himmel Street, Frau Diller's. An important note about Frau Diller. She has one golden rule. Frau Diller was a sharp-edged woman with fat glasses and a nefarious glare. She developed this evil look to discourage the small idea of stealing from her shop, which she occupied with a soldier-like posture and refrigerated voice, and even breath that smelt like Heil Hitler. That's a good way of describing it. The shop itself was white and cold and completely bloodless. The shop... Sorry, read that sentence. Blah. It shivered with a little more severity. Oh, thank you. You don't have to follow, you can just listen if you want to. I lost my place again. The other buildings on Hamel Street, Frau Diller administered this feeling, dishing out the only free item from her premises. She lived for her shop, and she lived for the Third Reich. Even when the rationizing started later in the year, she was known to sell certain hard-to-get items under the counter and donate the money to the Nazi Party. On the wall behind her usual sitting position was a framed photo of the Fuhrer. If you walked into the shop and didn't say Heil Hitler, you wouldn't be served. As they walked by, Rudy drew Lysol's attention to their bulletproof eyes leering from the shop window. Say Heil Hitler when you go in, he warned her stiffly, unless you want to walk a little further. Even when they were well past the shop, Lysol looked back and the magnified eyes were still there, fastened to the window. Around the corner, Munich Street, the main road and outer mulching, was strewn with slosh. As often the case, a few rows of troops in training came. Marching past, the uniforms walked upright, and their black boots further polluted the snow. Their faces fixed ahead in the concentration. Once they'd watched the soldiers disappear, the group of Steiners and Lysol walked past some shop windows and the imposing town hall, which years later would be chopped off at the knees and buried. A few of those shops were abandoned and still labeled with yellow stars, the anti-Jewish slurs. Further down, the church aimed itself at the sky, its rooftop sturdy of collaborated tiles, the street overall a lengthy tube of grey, a corridor of dampness. People stooped in the cold and splashed sound of watery footsteps. On one stage, Rudy rushed ahead, dragging Lysol with him. He knocked on the window of the tailor shop. She had been able to read the sign. She would have noticed that it belonged to Rudy's father. The shop was not open yet, but inside a man was preparing articles of clothing behind the counter. He looked up and waved. "Hi, Papa," Rudy informed her. There was soon amongst a crowd of various sizes, Steiners, each waving or blowing kisses at their father, or simply standing and nodding hello, in the case of the oldest one, then moving on towards the final landmark before school. It was a place nobody wanted to stay and look at, but almost everybody did, shaped like a long, broken arm. The road contained several houses with lacerated windows and bruised walls. The Star of David was painted on those doors. Those houses were almost like lepers. At the very least, they were infected with the sores of the injured German terrain. Schillerstrasse, Rudy said, the road of yellow stars. Further down, some people had been moving around. The drizzle made it look like ghosts, not humans, but shapes moving beneath the lead-colored clouds. "Come on, you two," Kurt, the oldest of the Steiner children, called back, and Rudy and Lysol walked quickly towards them. "Why, thank you. I'm pretty self-conscious about my voice. I always think it sounds really nasally. The cold isn't helping. It's just right for reading. Oh, thank you." Da-da-da-da. At school, Rudy made a special point of seeking Lysol out during the breaks. He didn't care that the others made noises about the new girl's stupidity. He was there for her at the beginning. He would be there later on when Lysol's frustration boiled over, but he wouldn't do it for free. Just so you know, she isn't actually stupid, she just doesn't know how to read, as it was established early on in the book, because she came from a very poor family and wasn't educated. Okay, moving on to the next bit. "The only thing worse than a boy who hates you is a boy that loves you." I feel that. In late April, they returned home from school for the day. Rudy and Lysel waited on Himmel Street for the unusual game of football. They were slightly early. No other kids had turned up yet. One person they saw was the gutter-mouthed Piffikins. I hate pronouncing this word. Oh. Look there, Rudy pointed. A portrait of Piffikins. It was a delicate frame. He has white hair, he has a black raincoat, brown pants, decomposing shoes, and a mouth. And what a mouth it was. Hey, Pifkins! As the distant figure turned, Rudy started whistling. The old man simultaneously straightened and proceeded to swear with ferocity that could only be described as a talent. No one seemed to know his real name, or at least if they did, they never used it. He was only called Pifkins, because you give that name to someone who liked to whistle, which Pifkin most definitely did. He was constantly whistling a tune called Radetzky March, and all the kids in school would call out to him and duplicate the tune. At that precise moment, Pifkins would abandon his usual walking style, bent forward, taking large, lanky steps, arms behind his raincoated back, and erect himself to deliver abuse. It was then that any impression of sonority was violently interrupted, his voice brimming with rage. On this occasion, Lysel followed Rudy's taunt, almost as a reflex action. Pifkins, she echoed, quickly adopting the appropriate cruelty that childhood seemed to require. Her whistling was awful. There was no time to perfect it. He chased them, calling out. It started with Gerschgeigen. Sorry, I have terrible pronunciation with my German. And deteriorated rapidly from there. At first he levelled his abuse only at the boy, but soon enough it was Lysel's turn. "You little slut!" he roared at her. The words clobbered at her back. "I've never seen you before." Fancy calling a 10-year-old girl a slut. That was Pifkins. It was widely agreed that he and Frau Hotspur would make a lovely couple. "Get back here," were the last words Lysel and Rudy heard as they continued running. They ran until they were on Munich Street. Not an easy language to pronounce. No, it's really not. Pifkins is spelt so weird. It's spelt Pfiffifikus. I don't know how else you're supposed to pronounce it. Thank you. Okay. "Come on," Rudy said, once they recovered their breath. "Just down here a little." He took her to Hubert Oval, the scene of the Jesse Owens incident. In case you're new, the Jesse Owens incident is when Rudy covered himself in charcoal. It's easier if you're German, I believe. You know shit. The Jesse Owens incident is when Rudy covered himself in charcoal and ran across a sporting fields, pretending to be Jesse Owens. Okay. And they stood hand in pockets. The track was stretched out in front of them. Only one thing could happen. Rudy started it. 100 meters, he goaded her. "I bet you can't beat me." Lysel wasn't taking any of that. "I bet you can." "What do you bet, little skirmish?" "Have you got any money?" "Of course not, do you?" "No." But Rudy had an idea. It was the lover boy coming out of him. "If I beat you, I get to kiss you." He crouched down and began rolling up his trousers. Lysel was armed and put it mildly. What would you want to kiss me for? I'm filthy." "So am I," Rudy clearly said. Rudy clearly saw no reason why a bit of filth would get in the way of things. It had been a while between baths for the both of them. She thought about it whilst examining the weedy legs of her opposition. They were equal to her own. There was no way he can beat me, she thought. She nodded seriously. This was business. You can kiss me if you win, but if I win, I get out of being goalie at football." Rudy considered it. Fair enough. They shook on it. All was dark-skied and hazy. The small chips of rain were starting to fall. The track was muddier than it looked. Both competitors were set. Rudy threw a rock in the air as the starting pistol. When it hit the ground, they could start running. I can't even see the finish line, Lysel complained. And I can? The rock wedged itself into the earth. They ran next to each other, elbowing and trying to get in the front. The slippery ground slurped at their feet and brought them down, perhaps 20 meters from the end. Jesus, Mary, Joseph, yelled Joseph. I'm covered in shit. It's not shit, Lysel corrected him. It's mud. Although she had her doubts, they'd slid through 5 meters towards the finish. Do we call it a draw then? Rudy looked over, all sharp teeth and gangly blue eyes. Half his face was painted in mud. If it's a draw, do I still get my kiss? Not in a million years, Lysel stood up and flicked some mud off her jacket. I'll get you out of goalie. Stick your goalie. They walked back to Himmel Street. Rudy forewarned, one day, Lysel, they'll be dying to kiss me. But Lysel knew, she vowed, as long as she and Rudy Steiner lived, she never would. She would never kiss that miserable, filthy sock girl. Especially not this day. There were more important matters to attend to. She looked back at her suit of mud and stated the obviously. She's going to kill me. Of course, it was Rosa Huberman, also known as Mama. She very nearly did kill her. The word skirmish featured heavily in the administration of punishment. She made mincemeat out of her. Okay, that's the end of chapter 4. And then the chapter 5 is called the Jesse Owens Incident. Okay, so they're going to go into more detail about Rudy Steiner's backstory. So that might be a bit more interesting. Okay. In Lysel's memory, it was like she'd actually been there for Rudy's act of childhood infamy. Somehow she could always see herself in his imaginary audience. Maybe she just liked the thought of a painted black boy running across the grass. It was 1936, the Olympics, Hitler's Games. Jesse Owens had just completed the 4x100-meter relay and won his 4th gold medal. Talk that he was subhuman because he was black, and Hitler's refusal to shake his hand was touted around the world. Even the most racist Germans were amazed at the efforts of Owens. And word of his feet slipped through the cracks. No one was impressed more than Rudy Steiner. I love the little historical influence that the story has sewn into it throughout. They're very accurate in terms of their timing of the Olympics, as well as sort of like just pre-World War II, like before the main part kicks off, you know. It's good. Yeah, it is very good. I enjoyed it a lot the first time I read it. What was I up to? Everyone in his family crowded around in their living room when he slipped out and made his way to the kitchen, pulled some charcoal off the stove and gripped it in the smallness of his hands. Now, he smiled. He was ready. It is very interesting. Yes, it is very interesting. Yeah, it's definitely the type of book that I enjoy reading. He smeared the charcoal on nice and thick until he was covered in black. Even his hair received a once-over. In the window the boy grinned almost maniacally at his reflection, and his shorts and singlet were quietly abducted. His older brother's bike pedaled up the street, heading for Hubert Oval. One of his pockets he'd hidden a few pieces of extra charcoal just in case some wore off. In Lysel's mind, the moon was sewn into the sky, the night clouds stitched around it. The rusty bike climbed to a halt at Hubert Oval fence line. Ruby climbed over. He landed on the other side and trotted weedily towards the beginning of the 100 meters enthusiastically. He conducted an awkward regime of stretches. He dug starting holes in the dirt, waiting for his moment. He paced around, gathering concentration under the darkness sky, with the moon and the clouds watching tightly. Owens is looking good, he began to commentate. This could be the greatest victory ever. He shook imaginary hands of the other athletes and wished them luck, even though he knew they didn't have a chance. The starter signaled them forward. A crowd materialized around every inch of Hubert Oval's circumference. They were calling out one thing, they were chanting Rudy Steiner's name, and his name was Jesse Owens. All fell silent. His bare feet gripped the soil. He could feel it holding between his toes. At the request of the starter, he raised to a crouching position, and the gun clipped a hole in the night. For the first third of the race, it was pretty even, but it was only a matter of time before the charcoaled Owens grew near and streaked away. Owens in the front, the boy's shrill voice cried, as he ran down the empty straight, towards the uproarious applause of Olympic glory. You could even feel a tape break in two across his chest as he burst through the finish line, the fastest man alive. It was only on his victory lap that things turned sour. Amongst the crowd, his father was standing at the finish line like the boogeyman, or at least the boogeyman in the suit. As previously mentioned, Rudy's father was a tailor. He was rarely seen on the street without a suit and tie. On this occasion, it was only a suit and a disheveled, I can't pronounce things to say, disheveled shirt. "Was dies lost?" he said to his son when he showed up at the charcoal glory. "What the hell is going on here?" The crowd vanished. A breeze sprung up. "I was asleep in my chair when Kurt noticed you were gone. Everyone was out looking for you." Mr. Steiner was a remarkably polite man. Under normal circumstances, discovering one of his children smeared in charcoal on a summer evening was not considered normal circumstances. "The boy's crazy," he muttered, although he conceded that with his 6 kids, something like that was bound to happen. "Well," Rudy panted, bending down, placing his hands on his knees. "I was being Jesse Owens," he answered, as though it were the most natural thing on earth to be doing. There was even something implicit in his tone that, what the hell does that even look like? Basically, he looked good in his clothes. Yeah, he made clothes, so he's got to look good in his clothes. He's got to advertise his work. What the hell does it look like? The tone vanished. However, when he noticed the steep deprivation whittled under his father's eyes, "Jesse Owens?" Mr. Steiner was the type of man who was very wooden. His voice was angular and true. His body was tall and heavy like an oak. His hair was like splinters. "What about him?" "You know, Papi. The black magic one." "I'll give you black magic." He caught his son's ear between his thumb and forefinger. Rudy winced. "Ow, that really hurts." "Does it?" His father was more concerned with the clammy texture of the charcoal contaminating his fingers. He covered everything, didn't he? He thought. Even his earlobes, for God's sake. Come on. On the way home, Mr. Steiner started to talk politics with the boy, as best he could. Only in the years ahead would Rudy understand it all, when it was too late to bother understanding anything. Okay, so we get a little peek into Rudy's past and how unique he is amongst the other children, even in times like this. Yeah, we can also see like examples of racism in Nazi Germany, that even someone who was recorded as the fastest human alive at the time was still discriminated against in the Olympics of all places. I forgot that Germany held an Olympics like pre-First World War. Yeah. Okay. On to the next paragraph. The contradictory politics of Alex Steiner. Point 1. He was a member of the Nazi Party, that he did not hate the Jews, or anyone for that matter. Point 2. Secretly, though he couldn't help feeling a percentage of relief, or worse, gladness, when Jewish shop owners were put out of business, propaganda informed him that it was only a matter of time before a plague of Jewish tailors showed up and stole his customers. Point 3. But did that mean that they should be driven out completely? Point 4. His family surely had to do whatever they could to support them, even if that meant being in the party. It meant being in the party. Point 5. Somewhere far down there was an itch in his heart, but he made a point not to scratch it. He was afraid of what would come leaking out. Okay, so you can see the sort of the pull in the German people about, who is opposed to the Nazi Party but still chooses to join them out of security. You can see that most of the German people aren't supporters but bystanders in the war, as you can think of most wars. Yeah, so it's an interesting perspective on the war, not one of even the Jews, but one of the people having to live on the losing side. I think Hitler wanted a pure race. Yeah, that was the propaganda that he wanted. It was funny. He couldn't get into art school and a bit of a failure. So he got very heavily into politics. And after his mother died, he became increasingly more radical. And he sort of attached his ideas onto these, I forget the word, conservative parties. And that sort of grew from there. He was very good at speaking, but he really disagreed with most of the people when he was a part of a party, so he just made his own. And that was the origin story of Hitler, essentially. So, just an amalgamation of hate, really. Okay, next paragraph. They walked around a few corners onto Himmel Street, and Alex said, "Son, you can't go around painting yourself black, you hear?" Rudy was interested and confused. The moon was undone now, free to move and rise and fall and dip into the boy's face, making him nice and murky like his thoughts. "Why, Papa?" "Because they'll take you away." "Why?" "Because you shouldn't want to be black people or Jewish people or anyone who's not us." "Who are Jewish people? You know my oldest customer, Mr. Kaufman, where we bought your shoes?" "Yes." "Well, he's Jewish." "I didn't know that." Did you pay? Do you have to pay to be Jewish? Do you need a license?" "No, Rudy." Mr. Steiner was steering his bike with one hand and Rudy with the other. He was having trouble steering the conversation. He still hadn't relinquished the hold of his son's earlobe. He'd forgotten about it. "It's like you're German or Catholic." "Oh, is Jesse Owens Catholic?" "I don't know." He tripped on a bike pedal and released the ear. They walked on in silence for a while until Rudy said, "I wish I was like Jesse Owens, Papa." This time Mr. Steiner had placed his hand on Rudy's head and explained, "I know, son, but you've got beautiful blonde hair and safe blue eyes. You should be happy with that. Is that clear?" But nothing was clear. Rudy understood nothing that night. It was the prelude to things to come. 2.5 years later, the Kaufman shoe shop would be reduced to broken glass, and all the shoes were flung aboard a truck in their boxes. Oh, so you were sort of right about the pure race thing. They really hinted about it in this part of the chapter, and like that you didn't want to be anything but pure German. The Other Side of Sandpaper is the next chapter's name. People have defining moments, I suppose, especially when you're children. For some it's the Jesse Owens incident. For others it's a moment of bedwetting hysteria. I'm not usually right. Well, you were right this time. It was late May, 1939. The night had been like most others. Mama shook her iron fist, Papa was out, Lysol cleaned the front door, and watched the Himmel Street sky. Earlier there was a parade. The brown-shirted extremists, members of the NSDAP, otherwise known as the Nazi Party, had marched down Munich Street, their banners worn proudly, their faces high as if it were on sticks, their voices full on song, accumulating in a roar of Renden, of Deutschland über alles, Germany over everything. As always, they clapped. They were spurred on as they walked to who knows where. People on the street stood and watched, some with straight-arm salutes, others with hands burned from applause. Some kept their faces controlled with contorted with pride and rallying like Frau Diller. And then there were scatterings of odd men out, such as Alex Steiner, who stood like a human-shaped block of wood, clapping slow and beautiful submission. On the path, Lysa stood with her papa and Rudy. Hans Hubman wore a face with shades pulled down. Some crunched numbers. Okay, hello. So this is sort of an example of the parades which they do, which is sort of a combination of parading around the Jewish people that they caught and like enforcing propaganda in the German people. So there was a big difference between those who like fully supported the Nazi Party and those who were only supporting them so they could stay safe. So you saw that divide between the people in the streets. Okay, next paragraph. Some crunched numbers. In 1933, 90% of Germans showed unflinching support for Adolf Hitler. That leaves 10% who didn't. Hans Hubman belonged to the 10%. There was a reason for that. Okay. Hans Hubman is the foster parent of our main character, by the way, in case you're new. In the night, Lysel dreamed like she always did. Lysel was our main character. At first, she saw brown shirts marching, but soon enough they led her to a train. The unusual discovery waited. Her brother was staring again. When she woke up screaming, Lysel knew immediately on this occasion something had changed. A smell leaked out from under the sheets, warm and sickly. At first she tried convincing herself that nothing had happened, but Papa came closer and held her. She cried and admitted the fact in his ear. "Papa," she whispered. "Papa, that was all." You could probably smell it. He lifted her gently from the bed and carried her into the washroom. The moment came a few minutes later. "Take the sheets off," Papa said, when he reached under and pulled out the fabric. Something loosened and landed with a thud. A black book with silver writing on it came hurtling and landed on the floor between the tall man's feet. He looked at it. He looked at the girl, who timidly stroked. He read the title with concentration. The Gravedigger's Handbook. That's what it was called, Lysel thought. A patch of silence stood amongst them now. The man, the girl, the book. He picked it up and spoke soft as cotton. A 2 a.m. conversation. "Is this yours?" "Yes, Papa." "Do you want to read it?" "Yes." A tired smile, metallic eyes melting. "Well, we'd better get reading then." 4 years later, when she came to write in the basement, two thoughts struck Lysel about the trauma of wetting the bed. Firstly, she felt extremely lucky that Papa had discovered the book. Fortunately, when the sheets were washed previously, Rosa had made Lysel strip the bed and make it up. "And be quick about it, you skirmish. Does it look like we've got all day?" Secondly, she was very proud of Hans Hubman's part in her education. "You don't think," she wrote. "You don't think it," she wrote. "But it was not so much the school that helped me to read. It was Papa. People think he's not so smart. And it's true that he doesn't read so fast. But I would soon learn that words and writing actually saved his life once, or at least words in a man who taught him the accordion." Okay, that's cute. So we have like more example of Hans being a good father, as all fathers should be. Okay, on to the next paragraph. First things first, Hans Hubman said that night. He washed the sheets and hung them up. "Now," he said upon his return. "Let's get this midnight class started." Lost my bit. The yellow light was alive with dust. Lysel sat on cold, clean sheets, ashamed, elated. The thought of bedwetting prodded her, but she was going to read. She was going to read the book. The excitement stood up in her. Versions of a 10-year-old reading genius were set alight. If only it was that easy. To tell you the truth, Papa explained up front, I'm not such a good reader myself. But it didn't matter that he read slowly. If anything, it might have helped that his reading pace was slower than average. Perhaps it would cause less frustration in coping with the girl's lack of ability. Initially, Hans appeared a little uncomfortable holding the book and looking through it. When he came over and sat next to her on the bed, he leaned back, his legs angling over the side. He examined the book again and dropped it on the blanket. Now, why would a nice girl like you read such a thing? Again, Lysol shrugged. Had the apprentice been reading the complete works of Goethe or any such luminary? That was what would have sat in front of them. She attempted to explain. When I was sitting in the snow, in case you don't know the backstory behind the book, when her brother was being buried, one of the grave diggers dropped the book, and that's how she came to possess it. The soft-spoken words fell off the side of the bed, emptying onto the floor like powder. Papa knew what to say, though. He always knew what to say. He ran a hand through his sleepy hair and said, "Oh, promise me one thing, Lysol. If I die any time soon, make sure to bury me right." She nodded with great sincerity. "No skipping chapter 6 or step 4 in chapter 9, he laughed, as did the bedwetter. "Well, I'm glad that's settled. We can get on with it now." He adjusted his position, his bone creaked like an itchy floorboards. The fun begins. Amplified by the still night, the book opened a gust of wind. Looking back, Lysol could tell what her papa was thinking, and he scanned the first page of the Gravedigger's Handbook. As he realized the difficulty of the text, he was clearly aware such a book was hardly ideal. There were words in there that he'd have trouble with himself, not to mention the morbidity of the subject. As for the girl, there was a sudden desire to read it that she didn't even attempt to understand. On some level, perhaps, she wanted to make sure her brother was buried right. Whatever the reason, her hunger to read that book was intense as any 10-year-old human could experience. Chapter 1 was called The First Step, Choosing the Right Equipment. In a short introductory passage, it outlined the kind of material to be cornered into the following 20 pages. Types of shovels, picks, gloves, and so forth were itemized, as well as the vital need to properly maintain them. This grave digging was serious. As Papa flicked through it, he could sure feel Lysol's eyes on him, as they read over and watched something, anything, to slip from his lips. "Here," he shifted again and handed her the book. "Look at this page. Tell me how many words you can read." She looked at it and lied. "About half." "Read some for me." Of course she couldn't. When he made... It's a shovel, not a shovel. It's a shovel, not a shovel. There's lots of different shovels, I'm guessing. I'm not a grave digging expert. Da-da-da-da. Well, do you pronounce shovel differently? Okay. When he made her point out any words she could read and actually say them, there were only 3. The main 3 German words for the whole page had 200 words on it. This might be harder than I thought. I would say spade. Ah! I see, but okay, they use the word shovel though, so I use the word shovel. I've always thought of still a digging tool. Yeah, it's the same thing. I've always thought of spades as like the smaller ones, but I guess you could call them trowels as well. But it doesn't matter too much. I mean, in the expert of grave digging, I bet they have both spades and shovels. He lifted himself forward, rose to his feet, and walked out again. This time he came back and said, "Actually, I have a better idea." In his hands there was a thick painter's pencil and a stack of sandpaper. "Let's start from scratch." Lysol said no. Lysol said no. Lysol saw no reason to argue. In the left corner of an upturned piece of sandpaper, he drew a square of perhaps an inch and shoved a capital A inside it. In the other corner, he placed a lowercase 1. So far, so good. A. More square shape than used for gardening. True. Did you look that up? Sorry. I guess shovels are used for grave digging and spades are used for gardening. Or the other way around, if that's how you looked it up. A for what? April. He wrote the word in big letters and drew a misshapen apple under it. Oh, we learned something new today. April means apple in German. He was a house painter, not an artist. When it was complete, he looked over it and said, "Now for B." As they progressed through the alphabet, Lysol's eyes grew larger. She had done this at school in the kindergarten class, but this time it was better. She was the only one there, and she was not gigantic. It was nice to watch Papa's hand as he wrote the words, slowly and constructed in primitive scratches. "Oh, come on, Lysol," he said, which he struggled later on. "Something that starts with S. It's easy. I'm very disappointed in you." Just need to find out the German word for pie now. I bet you could look it up and find out. Maybe they'll mention it later on, who knows. She couldn't think. "Come on." His whisper played with her. "Think of Mama." That was when the word struck her face like a slap, a reflex again. "Skorschminnicht." So that means pig. Apple pie. Yeah, I could use some apple pie right now. That sounds nice. And Papa roared with laughter, then quieted. "Shh, we have to be quiet." But he roared all the same and wrote out the word, completing it with one of his sketches. A typical Hans Huffman artwork. He just draws a stick figure of his wife. That's nice. "Papa," she whispered, "I have no eyes." She patted the girl's hair. She'd fallen into his trap. With a smile like that, you don't need eyes. He hugged her and looked again at the picture, with a face warm with silver. Now for tea. With the alphabet completed and studied a dozen times, Papa leaned over and said, "Enough for tonight? A few more words?" He was definite. "Enough. When you wake up, I'll play the accordion for you." "Thanks, Papa." "Good night." A quiet one-syllable laugh. "Good night, Skorschmick." "Good night, Papa." He switched off the light, came back to sit in his chair in the darkness. Lysol kept her eyes open. She was watching the words. Okay. I think that's the end of chapter 5. The next chapter is called The Smell of Friendship, but I think I might end it here because it's getting pretty late where I am. And my voice is dying. Alright, well thank you for staying for a while. It was nice talking to you. I'll be uploading this on a YouTube channel by the same name as my Twitch if you missed out on the beginning. Do you not need some water? I do need some water, but I currently can't leave my room because I'm in isolation. So I'll just do that before I go to bed. So I'll say goodbye. You need to protect that voice. Oh, thank you. My YouTube channel is under the same name as my Twitch. This is my first stream, so I'll upload the VOD of this stream in case you want to listen to the whole thing. Okay. Have a nice night, if it is night where you are, or morning, or afternoon, wherever it is. And I'll see you again sometime.